Thank you all for joining us today. We're tremendously appreciative of you donating some of your time, and we know how busy all of you are for the World Creativity and Innovation Week 2023 and World Creativity and Innovation Day, which is the International Day of Observance as part of the United Nations. So thank you all for being here, and we're very excited to talk about the topic of launching the new podcast at the Atlantic Center for Creativity called Finding Creativity. Alexis?
Thanks, Goran. Yeah, we have been working on this project for a little while, and it's kind of taken on a couple of different forms. So, a bit of background, I was working with the Canadian Network for Imagination and Creativity, which is our sister organization with the Atlantic Center for Creativity. And we were hosting these idea jams, monthly idea jams, and we had slowly started to have more guests participate. And it started to sort of give us the idea that, it's really great to talk to people about where they find creativity and how they find creativity. And so I reached out to my colleague, Ian Sherwood, who is here. Hi, Ian. And who's a fantastic singer-songwriter and music producer in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And I reached out to say, what would be possible in this world? Could this be possible? And what would the costs be? What would the timeline be? What would we need to have? I'd never done anything like this before. So Ian and I had a few meetings and we started to really think about it. And then it started to feel like it might not end up happening. We needed to find funding because we wanted to produce it at a top level and all those things. The producing part is getting the pieces together can be challenging. We thought it might start to slip through our fingers a little bit. And the chair of the Atlantic Center for Creativity, Mary Blatherwick, really kind of pushed us, encouraged us to say, listen, let's go out and find some of these funds. Let's see what we can do with it. Let's bring it from the Canadian Network for Imagination Creativity to the ACC and see what the steering committee there thinks. So I brought it to the steering committee at the ACC, and it was incredible what the response was. It was like, wait a second, like there's so much potential here. And it was most certainly Paul, who's also here on the call, who jumped in and said, there's such great potential for research here, and aligning with a lot of the research that he has been doing in his work and fields for the last little while. And I then figured out, as we started to put these pieces together, what did we want to investigate? How did we want to investigate it? And then I thought, of course, the first person I need to talk to about this is Stan Baines, because this is the person who lives and breathes exactly what we're trying to find in finding creativity, which is that gap between I am not creative, and yet my work has a ton of creative aspects in it. So while I'm a person who would say, no, like I don't draw, I don't do arts, I don't do anything like that. I'm not creative. And yet your work demands creative thinking and imagination and a curiosity and a way to inspire people that you work with to move projects and the work that you're doing forward. So really to look at what that gap is. And that's kind of the background to where we're at this moment with what we're trying to do with finding creativity.
Wow, that's just so amazing. And it seems so timely because we certainly, are living at a time where we are truly invited to explore creativity and to be more creative, to somehow reveal it and to enable it and to be able to share it, with others. And more broadly, at community levels, at educational levels, certainly as part of addressing some of the key challenges of our times, from the climate emergency to the migrations, to the changes to the nature of work. And so I'm just intrigued, sort of why you went with that title and how you arrived at that title, Finding Creativity. What prompted you to sort of take this particular approach to this podcast?
Well, I have to say it was listening to Stan talk about his work in a conference that we were both presenting at last April online, which was for the World Creativity and Innovation Week. And the title of Stan's presentation was the mop bucket, creativity in a mop bucket. And I sort of went, wait a minute, this is about finding creativity. And I was really inspired by Stan's talk, but then also the question about what were we trying to research and what would be available to us in research. And I might just loop Paul in at this moment. Paul, you were one that when I brought this to the table at the ACC, it was really interesting how quickly you were able to succinctly go, hang on a second. This is grounded, like this is an opportunity for us as a center to activate some real research through these interviews. And I'm just wondering, looping back to that idea and this concept of going after finding creativity, what was it that triggered that response for you?
In my research, doctoral studies, I've been digging into the black box of why is that we always pigeonhole the arts as the location for creativity when it is an innate human ability and involved in everything that we do and have ever done as a species. And we have difficulty identifying and isolating what it is that makes people particularly imaginative, creative in their workplace. And it's a real black box. So I've been digging into that in educational leadership, and I want to, after this, is to go deeper into the broader community to say, well, where is it happening in other professions? And it's striking how it's where the linchpin of where the innovation takes off in education is very different than it is in the corporate world. And so, in seeing that, I could readily get excited with the same question you're asking here. With Stan finding great success through his imaginative capabilities to elevate himself in his workplace with the work he does. That's exactly the type of phenomena that we need to be probing deeper at, because there's very limited to like no understanding in the literature of what's actually happening. What are the key pieces that are involved? We have some of them. We know that people are imaginative. We know people have those capabilities. We know how it happens. We can watch it happen in the brain. But what makes that operational? What brings it to the workplace? What makes it something that actually propels their job in their industry? So here we are, digging deeper, broadening out how we do it.
So I'm going to loop Stan in now, because this is like, it literally was exactly the question. Stan, are you going to come onto this podcast and talk to me about creativity?
Oh, and so begins the instant panic, right? Because I think what happened is that when we talk about where creativity lies and all that stuff, Paul's very correct, and we've had all these discussions before, is that it really is aimed towards the visible and obvious arts, dramatic arts, musical arts, visual arts, right? Things that society generally can put their hands on and go, this is artistic, this is creative, somebody's thrown a passion to this. So that when you look at the day-to-day life, so for instance, I'm in charge of staff who clean. Well, not really much creativity to that. See dirt, clean it, right? And it's repetitive work, and it's very boring work. In fact, in the job description, it says this is very boring work, right? So you start to kind of really zero in on, well, where can I find creativity in any of that stuff? But when you start to look at cleaning, for instance, as an art form, well, I'm not going to clean the same way somebody else is, and somebody else won't do it my way. Well, then you start to actually realize that a lot of the everyday things you do have a creative aspect for, but because you're not labeling it as dramatic, or you're not labeling it painting, or you're not looking at it as some musical operatic gift that you've given to the world, then we get lost in that, right? Even doing something as simple as being part of this, like I recognize now as I'm going through my creative journey that there's a lot of creativity in me, but unless I'm going to actually think about it with a heart matter, to go, no, don't just assume just because I don't paint something or I don't sing something that there's no creativity there. It's trying to break the molds of what we've said is creative, and actually recognize on a day-to-day basis, yes, I'm trying to fit piping around my hot tub that shouldn't actually be there, but I'm trying to create a water fountain to make it nice. Well, that's oddly creative, right? It's a mess, but it's a creative piece. So, right, it's exciting when you start to really grab a hold of that and go, where is this happening in real life? How are we hitting the ground and running with this? Not just kind of pushing in the obvious places. I still want to hear about music. I still want to hear about painting. And I want to hear what drives those people to do that, because that same passion drives my everyday then to find that creativity in myself to do different and other things.
That's amazing. Exactly. And I think that's why I went, you're the person I have to talk to first. And then I'm going to loop Ian in here because, here I am talking about my colleagues and this new network and these new center for creativity and all this like research that we want to do. And I kind of go, and can you help me? Could you produce this? And I just want to know, like, here I go sort of like plopping this idea on your lap going, is this possible? And I'm just curious again, like first ideas when I first came, like first responses, and then also like where you see it now versus where we began, I think is my question.
Oh yeah, I mean there was a bit of an evolution, wasn't there? I mean when we first had that conversation about it, Alexis, and you said this is something that I've been thinking about, and I wonder if maybe this could be a podcast. I thought, well, absolutely, it can be a podcast, not just because anything could be a podcast, but because this is actually a really great idea. And it's a conversation that I have frequently with people who are in an artistic field, but also just friends who maybe aren't. And the idea of this gatekeeper society, or not a society, but these folks who maybe are perceived to have creativity versus what someone else in another field or doing something else with their life, they don't have it. And I've always been kind of a proponent of like, that's a fallacy, that doesn't exist. Like everyone is creative to some extent, and it's just a question of recognizing it. And so when we started having these conversations, I was immediately in on it. I'm like, yes, I'm already having this podcast on a frequent basis with people in my life, so let's do it, let's record it. And then I mean we had a bunch of great coffee meetings where we drank a lot of coffee and we sat on your balcony and we sussed out ideas. And when we started it was like, okay, well, what is this going to look like? Are we going to have like 4 different components to it? And it was quite evolved and quite elaborate. And then I think we were able to kind of distill it down to basically what is the nucleus of what we're trying to say and what we're trying to do. And it is basically, and I think, Stan, you are a wonderful first guest, because it is like, it's a line drive down the center of what it is we're trying to do, and what it is we're trying to get across is the fact that creativity is not held by any certain elite group of people. It is something that and Paul, I think you said innately, we're all as human beings innately born with this, and somewhere along the line we lose touch of that. We lose, or at least we feel like we lose touch of it. We feel like, oh well, actually no, I maybe was creative when I was 5 years old playing with Lego or drawing, but I'm not really. But I mean, breaking that down and letting people know that no, actually you are, and let's explore that and let's celebrate that, because I think that's super important. And that's where we ended up. And I think having a conversation with someone like Stan, and having someone as eloquent and thoughtful as Stan was talking about it, I think is basically what we're trying to do now. I think we've landed in a good spot.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, Paul, if you want to jump in, because you were really instrumental in helping to shape the questions. So Goran, one of the things that we've done with this podcast is we're looking at really framing. We're doing a few episodes as a sort of a test run for all of us, pilot. So this is really like our launch is actually the beginning stages of what we hope is going to be some in-depth actual research into perceptions and understanding of creativity, and how people around the world in all fields of work and life, how do they define it, and how do we build these associations with it that also influence me and sort of make me feel like I can disassociate, or I am disassociated with the idea. And Paul, you were really instrumental in helping me to framework these questions. And I'm wondering, do you want to talk a little bit more about that framework you've been developing, and just this way of looking at in what you're doing right now in terms of imagination and leadership, But here we're looking at creativity. And so would you just take us through some of those steps? Because it was really, you've been able to really help this podcast by helping me to craft the way that the questions are coming out and the order in which we're going through getting to the bottom of this.
Yeah, the framework that was developed was like, I used the term imagination. I initially was coming at it through the lens of creative pedagogy and realized I'm not really talking about the making part. We're talking about what's really happening with the ideas. And so that's where the focus would just get tightened into that zone, what's happening in the brain and the activity from there. So the questions are, and I'm trying to find out what's caused people to gain those capabilities. Where do they develop them? How do they get stronger? Because I mean, if everyone's born with an imagination, if you don't grab that idea that comes through your head and do something with it, it goes away, right? So it's not actually brought into the world, or you lose confidence in that at some point and you stop building it up. Or those that do gain the confidence in their imaginative ideas, they get really good at going back in and out of that zone of that type of cognition and allowing it to happen. Or when the idea comes to them, they know to latch onto it, that's a special one. And you build those practices up, and there's all kinds of drives and energies that go along with that. Behaviors with siblings, free play as a kid, activities you're signed up in, group activities. And so looking back at that, at first I want to understand how people understand the words that we're sharing, imagination or creativity. How are you defining it? What contexts do you have imaginative and creative behavior? What are your behaviors? What do you do? Looking back, how you think you developed them, where you think they came from, and how would you share it with other people pedagogically? How would you promote that with others in your community? Mm-hmm. And those all give lenses on different perspectives on how you understand what's happening and how you bring it into the world.
Mm-hmm. And then there's one other additional piece. We have another research colleague, Janet Kunk, who's not able to be with us today, from Cape Breton University, and her world is nursing. And so she really asked for another question, another aspect of our interview, to inquire about the relationship between creativity and health and well-being. And so how do we look at creative acts and being creative or imaginative and engaging with those parts of ourselves and finding those places where we can, how does that relate to our sense of self, our health, our well-being, and does it affect that in a positive or negative way? And in what situations might that have an effect? So what we've been able to do, what we're hoping to do with this podcast, is really look at getting some semi-structured. Obviously, there is a structured interview question sequence, but we need to be able to have flow and conversation. And Stan and I definitely need to be able to go off into a tangent and catch ourselves and come back again. But it is that feeling that we're going through this as a real analysis of how individuals who may not see themselves particularly as a defined creative, as in possibly associated with artistic practice, how do we actually enact creativity in our lives? How does it affect us? And how does it affect the people that we work with? And maybe that's where I'll just come back to you, Stan, and loop you in terms of that, the team that you work with, the people that you are training up, and all of those students that you interact with, and just that relationship between inspiring creativity in others and what you might encounter in a day or within the work that you do, and how does that play out sometimes?
So some of the times, right, because I've been processing that specifically rather, sometimes it's out of sheer necessity, because we do a lot of putting out fires in my job, right? Like, you deal with a lot of emergency situations. You have to think very quickly on the fly. So a lot of the creative sparks that will happen are out of sheer necessity to solve a problem immediately, to put things back to a level of normal. But what what I find is that even in the rush of all of that stuff, and as you're trying to coordinate people and get them on board, and you're trying to brainstorm with multiple people very rapidly to, you know, deal with a situation that may or may not close a building or something, at the end of it, there's such a sense of relief, because you can tell that sometimes it's by the book, but then sometimes no, we actually went outside of the box, and now we have to kind of continue to run with this. We need to keep doing this because there's a sense of accomplishment, right? Even in the more calmer aspects of the job, where, you know, how are we going to accomplish this, or how are we going to move that, or how are we going to clean this? The more that we can tap into the individual, we're so locked into this old school hierarchical way of doing things. It's always been done like this, therefore that's the only way that it should be done. Well, I often find myself quite comfortable in that, because that's what I'm familiar with. But then when a new idea sparks in from someplace I wasn't expecting, like a brand new employee who will come in and go, well, why have you always done it that way? And you don't have an immediate answer because you're locked in there. It's there. It's there within those conversations and discussions that you go, okay, talk to me about it. And you can almost feel a physical change happening, where it's like, you know what, I'm on board with this idea. I'm doing this. And even when there's minor failures, we don't even look at them as the failures. We look at them as, okay, that's a speed bump. How do we overcome that? So it almost, if you watch like a tree grow, it's almost like you can see each branch kind of take place until we actually finally solve the problem, and there's our full tree. So I agree with Paul. There's a sense of well-being that really does come from it. But again, a lot of it has to, you have to be kind of aware of it to go, what am I attempting to accomplish? How am I using every available resource and person to mine and their advantage to be able to actually get to the end of this problem? And then you start to look forward ahead of things. So rather than always being in damage control mode, you're now in prevention mode. So how can we think of something to prevent this from happening again? What can we kind of do that brings us 2 or 3 steps down the road, so that we're actually always prepared, so that you live in a sense of calm, or like what I like to say, a sense of joy, a joyful calmness, because then you're not living in the peaks and valleys of happiness and failures. You're living in a constant state of joy, because you're always kind of predicting, you're always kind of networking, you're always kind of talking with everybody, so that you create a sense of joy, calm, to go, doesn't matter what comes at us, we're mentally ready, we're emotionally ready, and we're thinking, we're brainstorming, and we're moving. So yeah, I think that's very important.
Can I just jump in there, Alexis? Stan, you said something really, really salient there, and I thought that was really, really great when you were talking about, you know, maybe a new coworker will come in and they'll have this new, fresh idea for something that we've been doing the same way all along. And I think the idea of creativity in the context of a village or a workplace or something, like the idea of it being something that's not necessarily even individualistic, even though the idea might come from an individual, creativity sort of helps the whole group. It helps society kind of grow and morph. I love that idea, the visual of the tree as well. But I mean, we can, you know, sometimes we don't even necessarily get stuck in ruts. We just get, you know, on a path, and as a group or a workplace or something, we start going in a direction that is working. And if we all had going off in different directions all the time, you know, like the wheels might come off the bus, but then you have one person come in and they have a new way of doing things, and it kind of takes things in a slightly different direction. So I don't know, maybe that's something we'll have to look forward to in another podcast coming up, the idea of creativity helping the whole.
Well, I think that's a good, I'm going to toss this back to you, Ian, because I think that that's one of the reasons why I wanted to reach out to you to help me co-produce this is, you know, your curiosity about this, right? And how we can, how you envision some of that investigation playing out in this podcast. Or what would you like to see, you know, coming forward as we move forward with this?
Well, you know, I think, well, that's a brand new idea. So I don't know. We'll have to bat that one around. I just love the idea of, because I think there are so many different ways in which we can tap into creativity in sort of hidden holes and behind doors that don't necessarily lend themselves to what we would call creative. You know, like there are folks, and we already have a couple guests lined up who fall into that category where, maybe there are people who don't even necessarily, even when they're on the podcast, don't even really know if they're creative. And we talked a little bit about this, Alexis, about the idea of sort of like a reverse intervention where the person, in the guest comes to the realization of like, oh yeah, I guess actually what I'm doing is sort of creative, but I don't know why I'm here. But then, it's like, no, actually this is really great. Like I just love that idea, because that is, again, the whole point of the podcast. If we can have that realization happen in real time on the podcast as well. So exploring moments like that, I think are what I'm really looking forward to.
Great. And I think our hope is that we're going to, we're looking at a couple of different community and partnership grants through SSHRC and all the rest of it. So eventually, we're hoping to head towards publication where we will have some real tangible data that we've collected, that we've been able to process that data thematically and through discourse and content, and really pull out the language that individuals are using. And I think also that it's the demographics, the breadth and the width of the who we're trying to connect with, because there's a lot of different communities and individuals out there who do not define creativity as a word in the way that maybe a Western academic lens might. And so actually to label something as creative or this is creativity, it's actually embedded in a part of living. There isn't something that is separate from me that I am or am not good at. It actually just is me, and it is part of how I see the world. And so I'm intrigued to really deep dive again into the different perspectives from many different people, from different aspects of culture, different aspects of language, different, how can we really get into some in-depth work into where are the roadblocks that make us sort of think in one direction or feel in one direction, and yet the availability of new ways of thinking might be, like you say, might just be someone who's coming in with a new idea, going, well, actually, in my family or in my culture, or in the way that, we don't have a word for this. But it's just so I've had to learn, there's individuals I've spoken to with this, the word creativity is completely foreign. And it's like, I don't understand what I don't see that as something that's an isolated thing. And so I want to talk to those folks and really get into what are we looking at as a larger society, when we will have different perspectives of the idea of creativity and how they manifest themselves.
I just want to jump in very briefly there and just say how amazing your invitation sounds, because on one hand, I would like to just pick up on what Paul said, that as much as we have been thinking about creativity through our various cultures around the world and sort of civilizationally, it's interesting that we don't necessarily really know what it is. Creativity seems to be both empowering and mysterious and accessible to us, and yet it's hard to put a finger on exactly what it is. We have thought about it, I guess, in the Western tradition through more of a kind of processual view. Creativity as a process, something that people that are trained in creative practices, such as you, Alexis, and Ian, that are professional actors or musicians. We've also thought of the outcomes. And I love the invitation that we're hearing you say, that it's more than those things, that it's more than the process, and it's more than the outcomes. I love what you said there, Stan, that it also changes how we interact with each other, with our communities, and with the world, and it changes how we feel. And that to me seems quite profound, because if we are indeed to engage these challenges that the United Nations are sharing with the world, the Sustainable Development Goals, it feels as if we kind of have to approach everything creatively. And that attitude that you talk about, Stan, the one of joy that seems infused with possibility, seems really so empowering and enabling, and this invitation for all of us to access it, I think, is really quite fantastic. So thank you for sharing that. It's really, really interesting, and I can't wait to hear more episodes.
Well, maybe we could just listen to the opening. We can just drop that in and you can have a little listen.
Yeah, let's do that. I'm just going to open that, so forgive me for one moment. I'm just going to share the screen.
Or share, yeah.
Okay, here we go. This episode is entitled Finding Creativity in the Bottom of a Mop Bucket, April 21st.
Would you say you are creative? I mean, if someone were to ask you, are you creative? Would you answer yes? Or would you stall a bit? Maybe back away, shake your head? Would you feel a little embarrassed or shy? Or is it an absolute no? Welcome everyone to the ACC podcast, Finding Creativity. The ACC is the Atlantic Centre for Creativity, a volunteer-led organization that promotes creativity in all forms, including research, professional development, and partnerships across Atlantic Canada. The ACC is made up of scholars, educators, artists, managers, representatives from innovation centres, and community partners. We work to infuse creativity in many different areas throughout the Atlantic region and support the growth of new ideas and solutions to social, cultural, and economic challenges. But what is creativity? Where do we find it? As a Centre for Creativity, we think it's important to find out. Are there gatekeepers for creativity? What are some of the perceptions and even misconceptions about creativity that are out there? Through a series of conversations with successful creatives from all walks of life, this podcast will deep dive into these questions as we try to find creativity.
We can pause there.
Wow, it sounds so fantastic. Congratulations to you all. We're very excited to be participating with you on this journey, and we can't wait to hear who else you've got lined up. This is sounding fantastic.
Thanks so much, Goran, and thanks to this great team for joining us.
Mhm.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for making it happen.